This special meeting of the Town Council of Los Gatos. With our main topic is about 5G cell sites and whether creating a master agreement to help staff do that more efficiently. If we could start off with a roll call, please.
Councilmember Sack.
Here.
Councilmember Hudis.
Here.
Councilmember Badami.
Here.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Here.
Mayor Rennie.
Here. Thank you. Could you roll our meeting decorum video, please?
The public is welcome to participate at town council meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meetings is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. At each meeting, the following expectations of civil conduct shall apply. 1. For the benefit of the entire community, the town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the council agenda. 2. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at council meetings. 3. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at town council meetings. 4. All public comments at the town council meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. 5. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the mayor may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the council exiting the chamber. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the council would return to the chamber and the mayor would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a council meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code Section 403. These expectations of conduct also apply to meetings of all town boards, committees, and commissions.
Okay, thank you. Since this is a special meeting of town council, we don't do verbal communications for items not on the agenda. There'll be an opportunity to speak on our agenda item a little bit later. So with that, we will go straight to our one agenda item, which is a study session to discuss the potential master license agreement for telecommunications facilities in the public right-of-way in Los Gatos. And I will turn this over to staff.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for having us. I'm Nicole Burnham, the Director of Parks and Public Works, and Gabrielle Whelan, your town attorney, is going to help me with tonight's presentation as well. If I can get Arn to start screen sharing. Perfect. Thank you. So as the mayor introduced, we're here to talk about telecommunication installations on town infrastructure. So next slide. So the town was approached by AT&T to enter into a master license agreement, specifically to install what we call small cell infrastructure on town streetlights at designated locations. So the photo at the bottom of this page is one to keep in the back of your mind for the rest of this presentation. This is actually an AT&T installation that's in San Jose. So this is the kind of installation we're talking about, on a light pole with the piece at the top and then a couple of boxes down the pole. That's essentially what the aesthetics of it look like. So I wanted to call your attention to that. we're going to talk tonight about both some technical details that I'm going to talk to you about, and then Gabrielle will talk to you about some of the legal standards that govern the installation of telecommunications. We also just wanted to point out that in advance of tonight's meeting, in addition to advertising as part of the council study session, we did post on social media to encourage engagement from the community and participation from the community. We think this is a topic that they will be interested in. Next slide. So why do we need small cells? Why are telecommunications industries interested in this? Well, I don't think I need to tell any of you, we're all carrying mini computers all over our bodies at this point and in our purses and pockets all the time. And all of that wireless connectivity increases the demand on the system. And the small cell installation, so we're not talking anymore about the big towers that we were talking about, 20, 30 years ago. We're now talking about these small discrete installations at the top of telephone poles or top of light poles or even on the top of buildings that could help that now improve capacity in a really small range of area. So these cast signal 20 to 30 meters, maybe a little bit more. And they're especially important for areas of peak capacity. So areas like our downtown, where we might have a lot of people in cafes or bars, all of whom want to be looking at their cell phones while they're enjoying their time there. And that impacts that density of use impacts the reliability, and it impacts the network speed. So the small cell is a solution to solve that technological problem. The next slide. So what is a small cell? I showed you the picture earlier. It's a transmitter and receiver, typically attached to existing infrastructure such as streetlights and utility poles. While tonight's presentation is being driven by a request from AT&T for their desire to have infrastructure in our high volume areas, we also acknowledge that other telecoms may indeed come to the town in the future looking for similar master license agreements to install their own infrastructure. And so that prompted us to want to talk with you about the broader kind of concept and how we might manage that and handle it in the future. The next slide. And so what does that look like? What are we thinking about as staff when we're thinking about installations of these small cells? We're thinking about the location. What's the right location for these? And I would say that's true on both a macro level, which we're going to talk about at the next slide, but also a micro level. Like, are there, certain buildings we may not want them in front of for aesthetic reasons? Are there trees that the AT&T or the telecoms are going to care about potentially proximity to trees? So we need to be thinking about the location. We certainly want to think about aesthetics. Do we want them to be specific colors? Do we want them, to be in certain locations? Do we have flexibility in design? We certainly care about the integrity of the public infrastructure. And I guess, again, this is kind of the macro level of, this means additional weight on our light poles. So from an engineering perspective, is it designed to carry that weight? But also kind of at a more micro level, many of our poles have existing uses. They might have traffic cameras, they might have solar panels. So we want to make sure that any additional use by a telecom wouldn't conflict with our existing uses. We do have permitting mechanisms for this kind of installation. Hasn't been updated in a number of years, but we have the permitting mechanism when they are on private property. So what we're very specifically talking about tonight is the installation of this kind of infrastructure on city-owned assets and facilities. So with that, we know we need to be thinking about what the permit requirements and standards might be. And Gabrielle is going to talk about what our ultimate recommendations are with regard to that, but what we think we need to do in terms of staff work. But we acknowledge that we are here tonight telling you we need a permit program to address these installations. And one more slide from me before I give you to Gabrielle. So in terms of, I mentioned earlier, the macro location of these, I think you probably all will recognize this as a map of the town of Los Gatos with Highway 17 and kind of the greenish black line running up and down the page, and Highway 85 running kind of left to right. The lines in red are our arterial roads. You might recognize Los Gatos Boulevard, Blossom Hill Road, Winchester. These are the major arterial roads through the town that move a lot of traffic. The blue roads are our collector roads, East Main Street, as well as University and Santa Cruz, that sort of funnel people from our residential neighborhoods to the arterials. And our recommendation as staff at this point is that we allow these installations on arterial and collector roads, but not open up the whole town. So they wouldn't be in every residential neighborhood across town. But we can happy to have more discussion about that as we proceed through the study session. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Gabrielle to talk about more legal issues.
Thank you. This is Gabrielle Whelan, town attorney. And the benefit of entering into a master license agreement would be that it would allow the town to pre-approve the locations where the small cells are desired, and also to pre-approve the appearance of the installations. Next slide, please. Per state law, telecommunications providers already have the right to use public right-of-way. And under the current state of the town's code, a telecommunications provider would come to the town for an encroachment permit on a case-by-case basis. Next slide, please. While telecommunications providers are authorized to use public right-of-way, state law also provides that cities and towns retain the right to regulate the time, place, and manner of those installations. And case law has interpreted time, place, and manner to include the aesthetics of an installation. Next slide, please. One question that arises frequently is whether cities or towns can charge for the use of a streetlight pole. The Federal Telecommunications Act governs in this area, and the Act has designated the Federal Communications Commission as the entity that has authority to establish rules and regulations for how cities and towns allow use of their right-of-way. And the FCC has said that a charge of $270 per pole annually is predetermined to be reasonable. And so cities and towns can absolutely charge that amount. If a town or city can demonstrate that its costs of allowing the infrastructure on its facility exceeds the amount of $270 per pole annually, the entity can provide proof of that, and then the city or town would be able to charge a higher amount. We have checked with neighboring jurisdictions, and neighboring jurisdictions are currently sticking with the $270 per pole annually. Next slide, please. Another question that comes up frequently is health concerns. And so per federal law, cities and towns don't have the ability to establish their own radio frequency emission standards. But cities and towns do have the ability to make sure that providers are meeting the radio frequency emission standards that have been established by the Federal Communications Commission. Next slide, please. So if the council is interested in having staff pursue this avenue, the next steps for staff would be to prepare a potential amendment to the town code for the council's consideration at a future meeting, to put together a permitting program that the town council would also review, and to negotiate a proposed master license agreement that would come back to the town council for review and comment. Next slide. And so the purpose of this study session is to determine the council's interest in pursuing such a program. Next slide, please. And if the council or any members of the public have questions, the Parks and Public Works Director and I are the staff contacts, and we've included our emails in the slide that's part of this presentation. And both of us are available to answer any questions from the council or the public.
So let me start off with a question. Looks like Maria's got one. We'll start with Maria. Vice Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It explains the program very clearly. I did have a couple of questions. One is, I know that we have different types of streetlights in town, especially in the downtown area. Do we know if our streetlights in the downtown area, the smaller ones, can handle this equipment? Or do we expect any issues? I know that we'll have some issues where we might already have other structure, cameras or other things on the light poles, but do we know that our poles can handle this right now?
I don't. And so that would have to be part of what we evaluate on a case-by-case basis as AT&T starts to select pole locations. They would be responsible for doing that evaluation and providing us guidance. I do want to mention that we have 2 representatives from AT&T in the audience as well. So if there are technical questions for them, we can bring them forward if you'd like.
Okay, mine were pretty simple. So I would guess that, the $270 that we could charge per pole, which other municipalities are doing, might have to be higher if in fact, the old fashioned style light poles we have downtown don't work, or would they do something else downtown?
Yeah, I think we should distinguish between the $270 a year annual fee and permitting and installation charges, right? So the expectation would be, as part of developing the permit program, I think we would have to develop a fee for the permit to offset the staff costs, just like any other developer pays permit fees to Parks and Public Works. When to offset our staff time, the same would be the case here. And then if upgrades were required, I think it's something we'd have to talk about during development of the master license agreement, but I think it would be fair for the town to set an expectation that if a pole needs replacement because of this installation, that the developer would pay for it rather than the town. That would be right. I mean, that would be part of what I might be thinking about as we enter into those discussions.
Okay, so those are things to think about as we move forward. I guess another question I had is, and we may not know this, do we have sufficient street pole density in these areas that the street poles would be sufficient, or would there still have to be installations on private property or elsewhere?
I have not been told in the brief discussions I've had with AT&T of the need for additional infrastructure. My understanding was they were targeting streetlight poles, but I wodo need to defer that question to them ultimately.
Okay, and I apologize for not having these questions earlier. These came to mind as I saw the presentation. These are just things I was thinking about. And then the last one is, one of the streets that was brought up was Winchester, and is part of that in Monte Sereno? And would this be then engaging Monte Sereno, or would we only be talking about our side of Winchester?
We'd have to limit it to town of Los Gatos street poles.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to follow up on one of Maria's questions. Could you put back up the map showing the red lines where we were going to allow? So when I look at this map, so there's a couple things that go through my mind. So I think it's our responsibility to help make sure there's good coverage in town. You might say, well, it's AT&T's fault, but ultimately our citizens come to us. If somebody's not getting good trash service, they come to us and say, you need to have a better contract or something. If they're getting bad bandwidth to their house, they're going to say, why does Los Gatos have bad bandwidth? So this is something that coverage is something I think we should think about, or at least don't do things that make it harder to have good coverage. And so when you look at this, you can see, that we're leaving a big piece up towards the mountains. Imagine getting maybe the top of Vista Del Monte or the top of Loma Alta, start getting up into those areas. It's a ways from where there can be any of these poles, and, where we're allowing them to do poles. And 5G, my understanding is it's got to be higher frequency, which means shorter waves, which have harder times going around hills and trees and so forth. So they tend to need to be more line of sight or closer together. So, I wanted to follow up more on Maria's question. I want to try to make sure we're not creating poor cell coverage sites by what we're limiting. So, maybe this is a good time to get some comment from our AT&T people in the audience. And really the question is, based on that, how well do you think you can do for coverage for our mountain people?
Well, thank you, council member and council members. And I want to thank Nicole and Gabriella too. My name is Tom Schuler. I'm a senior real estate manager for AT&T. I'm the lead for this small cell program in Northern California. Mr. Rennie, yes, your question or your response is correct. It's really a matter of coverage, the initial wave of these small cells, and they are kind of a solution as opposed to the larger macro sites. So it's driven by that need for coverage. So I can't say specifically how these things will affect the coverage of the top of Loma Alta, but I mean, it is now an option that it would be an option unless it is, and I think the town needs to be aware of some of the other, and I'm sure the city attorney has a term called effective prohibition. If you limit too much where you can place these sites, then you in effect are prohibiting the use. So main arterials were originally, and I've been in this industry for about 30 years, that was our original coverage, right? We wanted all the freeways, all the streets. Nobody knew that everybody's going to have a computer in their pocket. We were covering car phones. Now we're covering everything. So you might be, as Councilman Rennie mentioned, you might be prohibiting us from getting the coverage if you limit those areas. Now we have aesthetic powers, right? And I would also state that, every site, the master agreement is just kind of a tool that gives us the ability then to submit applications for each individual site, right? So doesn't give any right for us to build anywhere. But each site would be evaluated on its own. I'll also address the issue of the capacity, or excuse me, the structural issue. It's absolutely on us to make sure that the structural analysis is done. If the pole needs to be structurally improved or replaced, that is on us. So these things, the town is still, if we go the route of the master agreement, which I wanted to mention, there's also some, as we get into this, you'll find that the FCC order 18 also sets some shot clock limitations on the applications. So the master agreement helps cut that time. And we could have, I think it was mentioned, pre-approved designs. That's one route we've done where we have a couple of pre-approved designs. You have your standard Cobra head pole. This design works, and it's almost an administrative approval once we get that in there. So, and then for the decoratives, those are evaluated on a case by case. There are applications that can blend very well depending on that. So I've probably overstepped your question, but I hope that helps.
You haven't done enough of a coverage survey, but what we have some I call them collectors in town of Shannon and Kennedy that run up into the hills, and those are not included on that list. And as my understanding is, you start to get into the hills and the trees more, coverage is, going to be more difficult. And if we haven't listed Shannon or Kennedy as a place that you can put something on any of those poles, are we going to be limiting you to get good coverage, particularly as you start to maybe get over the hill in some of these streets where now the hills are between it and say Blossom Hill, or I guess North Santa Cruz was the other closest one, for example. Do you have any ideas of whether you might need access? And I don't know how well you know our town. But I would almost suggest maybe you need to potentially have access to either Shannon or Kennedy, so there's better coverage up in those areas.
Yeah, no, that is certainly, this is an alternative. This is a solution. And I will say, yes, I'm very familiar with the town. I was actually class of 75 with council member Mary Benami, born and raised. My father was a local city doctor there for many, many years. And so, yes, it's kind of fun to be talking to you because I'm live in Granite Bay now, and I've been here for about 25 years. But my home is Los Gatos.
Okay, let me go to Council Member Hudis and see what questions he has, whether they're more for staff or more for AT&T.
Yeah, I have a few for AT&T. Short. Is this network an alternative to the existing 5G network, or is it integrated with the 5G network?
It's integrated. These small cells support the macro cells, the larger macro cells.
If you don't get coverage off of the small cells, you might get coverage off of the main network without.
Yes, and and largely the first run is a capacity issue as opposed to purely coverage.
Okay.
So I think, as mentioned by Ms. Burnham, it was where there was a high traffic capacity for the system. That's where we're initially going.
Okay, and then my other questions relate to the small cells or nodes themselves. What frequency do they operate on, and what range do you get from the small cells? In other words, I'm trying to figure out whether someone who's a quarter mile away will be hitting one of these small cells.
Quarter mile is going to be a stretch. In terms of the frequencies, there's a broad range of frequencies. I'd have to get in, and I'm not an engineer. So, but I do, there is a broad range, but they usually are about between 1,200 and 1,500 feet is the range, depending on the topography, of course.
Okay, so is it fair to say with a quarter mile range and the red stripes that are on the map, much of the town would not be hitting these small cell sites, much of the residential areas?
Well, not if you were, not unless you put them into the residential areas.
And so my last question is how much of an issue or problem is it for these to be confined to the arterials?
Well, it's a problem if you don't have coverage in the residential areas and you need it, and that's the only solution.
But you do have coverage on your main network.
Yes.
Correct. You're just not getting the benefits of the small cell in those areas.
You might drop calls. You might not be able to use it to your phone or your computer if you're on Wi-Fi to its full capacity.
Okay. And I understand 5G is meant for IoT devices as well as phones and things like that, correct?
Yeah.
The goal is to hook up many devices that are, things like doorbells.
Right, and anything that will be benefit by being connected to the internet.
Okay, thank you.
And then before I go to Councilmember Dami, if I could follow up on that. So what it sounds like there's probably, by putting the small cells where there's a lot of traffic, it helps relieve the larger cells capacity, or frees up capacity in areas where there's a lot of traffic, where people are probably using it, so that there is more capacity available in the areas that only have coverage from the large. So effectively, we're helping the large ones have enough bandwidth and capacity to cover those other areas. And people might see it as, gee, I got 5 bars, but why is my internet not working? Well, it's because the capacity is full. So I think that it sounds like it's helpful to put it on it may help the whole town by helping to relieve in some of the high trafficked areas.
Absolutely.
Let me go to Councilmember, and unless you had more to say, let me go to Councilmember Badami.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up, and this may be inappropriate, but I just have to give a shout out to my former classmate. After 47 years, it's good to hear his voice. I did not make the connection with the name Sharon, but good to hear your voice.
It's your internet. Sorry, I went on my personal.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah,
I'm glad you're still alive, as am I.
You as well. We have some connections from back then, I think. Yes.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. This is a question, I guess, for staff and as well as the AT&T representative. If we went forward with a master agreement that covers the routes that are pointed out, where we have the highest volume and which would hit the busiest areas, if it looked like in the future, all of a sudden there are issues or asks to expand through town, then a new master agreement or an expansion could be added later, correct?
If I can answer that, I would say that's an issue that probably shouldn't be included in the master agreement. It's something that would be in your design guidelines, your permitting process, and or your ordinance, right? So you don't have to go back and do a new contract, because we're going to be subject to those guidelines and your ordinance anytime we want to submit a site. So it really shouldn't be, in my opinion, defer to the city attorney or town attorney. It shouldn't be in there.
Okay, I would like to know how staff feels like this could be handled.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Schuler's comments. I was picturing the master license agreement as being a shortcut and to be the locations where the town doesn't anticipate many conflicts. And then having the ordinance continue to provide for case-by-case evaluation in residential areas.
Okay.
So the master license agreement is a shortcut, but it doesn't preclude future individual consideration of other placements.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Councilmember Hudes.
Thanks. I had a question about the poles themselves. Is it once a small cell is installed on a pole for one company, does that take that pole? Does that make that unavailable for another company?
I would say effectively yes, because what happens is if you were to, I mean, you could do it, you could put another carrier, but you would have to get a separation between the antennas. So you would have to extend the pole probably 10 or 15 feet. So you won't see that happening in other cities. It's just too bulky of a foundation, and then it gets too big. So the answer is yes, but not in reality, no.
So essentially, if one carrier puts in a network in a town, they pretty much have a dominant position. Then, if and I don't know how frequently these are placed, but that would be the case, wouldn't it?
Well, there may be some favored locations, but I think in most cases there are enough streetlights close enough that you just would go to the next one down and get the same coverage. So if you aren't the first one in or the first one at that pole, that's why early on in the process, if say AT&T is in the middle of permitting a pole and Verizon comes in and wants to submit on that same pole, they'll know ahead. They'll know. You'll be able to say, no, AT&T's already there. And we'll have cooperative. We can have cooperative language into the contract as well.
I see. Okay. And this is a question for Ms. Burnham, Ms. Whelan. When we talk about permits, are these permits on a pole by pole basis?
Yes.
Fall under the master agreement?
Yes, they would be. So the master license agreement would cover, what AT&T or any other carrier might be able to do across the town, but each individual installation would get permitted pole by pole.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I have a question for staff, just to make sure I understand. So one thing that we've been asking staff to do is find ways to be more efficient. I'm assuming that by doing this master agreement, it helps Parks and Public Works be much more efficient with this part of their work they're going to be doing.
It takes away the broader question of where the master license agreement, but it still means on a pole by pole basis, we need to do structural evaluation and assessment and individual permitting. So it does help, but it doesn't reduce the overall volume necessarily.
Councilmember Badami?
But to that, I would add, that's the reason for the $270 per year poll charge. Is that correct?
No, I think that the $270 a year poll charge is just for use of the actual poll. But I think I might have mentioned earlier that we would be able to define and establish and adopt permit application fees and charges to offset some of the staff time associated with the review, which is pretty typical for our engineering permits.
Okay, because that's how I read it, that it would be collected to cover staff time to oversee and monitor the installations.
And
Okay.
I think that means in an ongoing basis, right? Like, being able to go out once a year or twice a year, actually look at a pole, make sure it's structurally stable. That's the annual ongoing. The big lift from a staff perspective is going to be in that permitting phase as the work rolls out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we probably want to wrap up in 8 minutes if possible. I think staff is looking for feedback that they should move forward with the master license agreement. After asking all the questions, I can say that I'm comfortable moving forward with it as suggested in our staff, as suggested in the presentation and our staff report. Councilmember Badami?
I'm also in support of it as well, moving it forward.
Thoughts from other council members? Councilmember Hudis?
Yeah, I'm very, very much in support of it. I had a couple of quick comments. Going back to ancient history, in 1995 or 1997, we had devices that looked like this from our light poles from a company called Metrocom. Metrocom went out of business. And so my suggestion is that, I'm sure AT&T isn't going to go out of business, but technology moves on. And so in our contracts, it would be good to address the end of life upgrade issues as well. And I don't see any more of the Metrocoms around, but they were around for a long time. The other thing, just thinking about is that if, and again, I don't know whether there's the opportunity to do this, but my understanding is that the underlying technology for this is something called radio area network, and that there is an attempt to have open radio area network that allows American companies to build equipment, because currently there are no American suppliers for this, and this open initiative is meant to allow that, so that we don't have equipment from unfriendly countries necessarily. So I would encourage looking into whether whoever the providers are headed toward this open RAN. I think it could be beneficial for our residents. I think it'll be very, very good to have the kind of coverage that this system can provide.
Can you clarify that acronym for me again? Open RAN?
Radio Area Network.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Risto?
Thank you. I'm also in favor of having staff move forward with doing a master agreement, looking into what we have to do to amend our telecom policy right now. developing the aesthetic standards and everything else. My understanding from the staff report is each of those items will come back to the council. So I think this is a good way to move forward.
And let me officially open public comment. I didn't say really that it was officially open for any members of the public in our attendee list. We have been talking to the experts from AT&T. If anybody else wishes to speak, please raise their virtual hand. And I don't see any, so I will close public comment on this item. Does staff need a motion, or the comments so far should be good enough for you, correct?
Yes, the comments suffice. Thank you.
And we'll see a master agreement come back probably on consent then.
I don't think we've determined whether we would want to put it under consent or new business, but
We'll come back to council in some
we'll
way.
come back to council.
Okay. Any other comments? There hasn't been any concerns or any dissent, so it sounds like move forward with that. If that's no more comments, then we will adjourn our special session, and we'll see you back in 18 minutes for our regular council meeting. Thanks.
Thank you.